I just sort of want to give you the platform to talk about what you'd like to talk about, and I have a few guiding questions, but sort of having you lead the conversation, I feel like is my main priority. So I guess some things that I was thinking about, and then I can let you talk, are just like your work seems to talk a lot about decoupling nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And I'd sort of like to hear more about why you view that as important and necessary. And then a couple other things are whether or not you see nuclear power as a viable energy source that can help us combat the climate crisis, or if there are sort of too many issues with it. And then the third thing is that our project does a lot of work with communities and aspects that nuclear things bring about that are often hidden. So we talk a lot about how nuclear weapons testing and uranium mining and other nuclear endeavors have impacted indigenous communities in ways that aren't sort of blatantly obvious and that aren't talked a lot about when you're talking about the history of these projects. So just hearing like your perspectives on that and anything that you think would be interesting to include in our project that we might have not thought of already.
Okay, that's quite a bit. I don't think I have anything really very relevant to say about the impact on indigenous communities and so on of nuclear testing. There have people who've looked at it and what the impact of, say, the Nevada testing was on indigenous communities, but I don't really know anything firsthand about
Mhm.
any of that. On the nuclear power question, of course, that is something I have looked at. So why is it important? It's important because uh, even though nuclear power, civilian nuclear power, has slowed pretty drastically in the last decade, um, there's still a lot of it, and I think it's important to make sure that it it becomes as little a platform for nuclear weapons as possible. So, so I may be saying something, Jessica, that you know you already know and are obvious. So just tell me to shut up, and I'll
Mhm.
skip over it. But uh, there are two uh, routes to nuclear weapons. One is highly enriched uranium. Natural uranium, is 99.3% uranium-235. But to get a bomb, you want to get 80% or more of uranium-235, which is the other isotope of uranium. Um, so that's one route, enrichment. And the second route is plutonium. And plutonium is produced in a nuclear reactor, including a civilian nuclear reactor. And but before the plutonium is used, it has to be separated in something called a reprocessing plant. And so the trick's not exactly the right word, but the goal, I think, is with civilian nuclear power is to make sure there's not a route that allows uranium enrichment, to become a path to nuclear weapons, and to make sure the plutonium is never separated from the spent fuel. And uh, so much of the uh, civilian nuclear power, almost all of it, is based now on light water reactors, such as the US has, um, or in the case of Canada, for example, natural uranium reactors. And the plutonium is not separated for civilian uses. So that's the first thing, to be sure that I think that to the extent possible, you do not try to separate the plutonium. The French have done it to some extent, and that is somewhat bothersome. The Japanese have done it to some extent, but uh, but but as long as nuclear reactors are based on the light water reactor or the natural uranium reactor, um, it's there's no reason to separate the plutonium. And when I first started looking at this, people thought the future of nuclear power was something called breeder reactors. A breeder reactor is um, you do separate the plutonium and then make nuclear fuel um, from the plutonium, and you just recycle it. So that reprocessing or separating the plutonium became critical to the breeder reactor future. And that was the prediction in the middle of 1970s when I first started looking at this. And that is now, fortunately, um, been pretty much given up around the world. That people are not talking about breeder reactors. Now, the second route, uranium enrichment, is so, as I said, natural uranium is 0.7%, less than 1% uranium 235. The light water reactors that the US and most other countries use is 3 or 4% uranium 235. So there is some enrichment that's necessary. And it used to be done by something called gaseous diffusion, where you would take a uranium gas and push it through kind of porous walls. And if you do it enough time, like 1,000 times, you can get a light enrichment. More recently, it's been done by centrifuges, where you just spin the gas at very high speed, and the uh, lighter uranium gets slightly separated from the heavier uranium isotopes. Um, and unlike gaseous diffusion, um, the centrifuge is a more, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a more dangerous technology, I guess, um, from the point of view of nuclear proliferation, because you could uh, from a plant that's designed to produce 4% uranium 235, rejigger the whole thing so that instead of 4%, you can get up to 80%.
Oh, wow.
So centrifuge technology is more problematic from that point of view. Now you can safeguard it so that you can have, for example, international inspectors at a centrifuge plant to make sure that it's not rejiggered to make 80% instead of 4%. But still, it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a concern, for example, with the Iranian effort a few years ago, where the U.S. was concerned that their enrichment could be used to, not that they've done it, but that it could be used to make more highly enriched uranium. Um, so, um, so the two big safeguards, I think, on nuclear power to proliferation is, one, to make sure you don't separate the plutonium, so you don't have a reprocessing plant. And two, that if you have a centrifuge plant making the 4% enriched uranium, that you have safeguards in place, international inspectors, to make sure that it's not being converted to make 80% or 90%. So
Yeah.
that's sort of you know that's my short uh, abbreviated statement about nuclear power.
Yeah, and I think that something that sort of comes to my mind, I wrote a paper on depleted uranium. Do you
Yeah.
have any sort of knowledge of that that you'd like to contribute to this?
No, not really. When you do the enrichment, you get an enriched product, and then you get depleted
Mhm.
uranium too. And the depleted uranium can't be used for weapons, so that it's not in itself any real concern.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
So I guess
Now,
yeah, go ahead.
well, the other part of your question is nuclear power necessary for
Mhm.
climate change? And so there there is some of a controversy about this. My own sense is that nuclear power is not necessary and is probably not even the most direct way to get climate change relief. Um, so if you replace, for example, if you replace a coal plant by a nuclear power plant, uh, the nuclear where the coal plant will produce a lot of carbon dioxide to greenhouse gas, um, the nuclear power plant will produce zero, basically. So that's good.
Mhm.
However, it takes maybe 10 years to build a nuclear power plant, and and a lot of money. And instead of doing that, if you replace the coal plant by a natural gas plant, you could do it much more quickly, and it wouldn't reduce the carbon to zero, but it reduces it by about half. So for the kind of immediate uh, sort of relaxation, or what, immediate reduction of greenhouse gases, um, uh, you're probably better off replacing the coal plants by natural gas plants, and then ultimately by renewable energy, solar and wind, which also produces essentially no carbon. So that's my sense that in the short term, the natural gas revolution, which replaces coal, is good and probably would do more per dollar invested than with nuclear. Um, and in the somewhat longer term, renewables, solar and wind, uh, look uh, as effective as nuclear, and and um, and a lot safer from the point of view of nuclear proliferation.
Mhm. Yeah, that's all really interesting.
It's true with solar and wind, that which are both variable sources. You kind of need some backup,
Mhm.
and that's an argument for nuclear, I guess. Um, right now, the backup is based on coal mostly, um, and natural gas to some extent.
Mhm.
Um, but in the long run, if you want to get away from carbon,
Yeah.
it would be nuclear. It would be the sort of non-variable
Yeah.
source. But but again, in the somewhat longer term, if you can get good storage technology, which is being developed, um, then even an economy based mostly on renewables, solar and wind, uh, could work, because if you could store it during the day, then at
Yeah.
night, when you don't, or when the wind stops blowing, you have some electricity you could draw upon.
Yeah.
So that's my sort of hopeful, more long term view of what's going on.